Now, will they invade? I'm not convinced they will. This is not an easy operation. This is not like D-Day landings in France. This is, where the channel is relatively small and short. Taiwan is a relatively long way away from China.
So, Tim, China's been caught surveilling the allied war games between the US and Australia. A cynic might say that's what the West wanted.
Well, I think the West would have expected it. It's almost inevitable that China will be watching this sort of exercise, and therefore not surprisingly. And I think it's not bad news for us that they do so, because deterrence in the round is all about sending messages in various different ways. And one of the ways you send messages is to conduct these sort of exercises and show that you are quite capable of doing whatever is necessary should the need come about. So on balance, I think it's a positive thing.
AUKUS, the security pact between Australia, the UK, and the United States. The US is giving nuclear submarine technology to Australia. Is this unprecedented from the US?
Unprecedented? Well, of course not, because it has this relationship with us, and it's given us nuclear technology ever since the Polaris program, a long time ago. So it's not unprecedented in that sense. I do think it's a good thing. Again, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think Australia needs nuclear-powered submarines. We've only got now nuclear-powered submarines. I actually regret that to some degree, because diesel submarines are actually quite useful for all sorts of other operations. But looking at Australia and its need and a capability to have to send submarines out into the Pacific, into the South China Sea, wherever, enduring 6-month deployments like as we do with our nuclear submarines is an important capability. So yes, in one sense, it's unprecedented in that the US doesn't hand this technology around freely, but I think it's a wise move, and that treaty is a very positive move, because we need, I'm sure you've heard this before, and lots of your listeners will have heard this before, but Russia has been described as bad weather. China is long-term global climate change. It's a longer-term serious threat. Russia, obviously, with what's happening in Ukraine, has been shown to be not quite as capable, to put it politely, as we might otherwise have believed. But China is definitely a longer-term strategic threat in all sorts of ways. Now, we mustn't overestimate that. China's not about to invade Europe, but it is nonetheless building a very strong military capability, and it is putting a lot of support and effort and money into many of the countries on the Pacific Rim, and indeed in places like Africa and elsewhere. And for Australia, that is a genuine threat. They're worried about what's going on in places like Papua New Guinea and on some of these other places, and with the islands that China is creating in the South China Sea. So Australia needs to step up to the mark, and I think they've been extraordinarily brave, in inverted commas, actually, in the way they've spoken up against what's been happening in China, and to a degree, they paid a penalty for it. China has given them a bit of a hard time in terms of trade, etc. So I think this is, it's a positive move in the sense that, and we go back to where we started, this is about deterrence. It's not about wanting a war. It's about displaying a capability that says if deterrence fails, we have the capability to engage in operations. And obviously that revolves a large chunk around Taiwan and the threat to Taiwan, but elsewhere in the Pacific as well.
Going back to submarines for just 1 second, do you think that they will be the distinctive vessel that we see in this potential conflict?
Yeah, I mean, submarines are very important capability. There's no doubt about that. And submarine technology has come, a long way in the last few decades. My oldest son actually was a nuclear submarine in the Royal Navy, so I'm a bit biased in one sense. But submarines are a very important capability, and there's no doubt from a UK point of view, for example, the government are investing huge amounts of money into our nuclear deterrent and into our nuclear attack submarines, and they are one of they're relatively safe. I mean, obviously, people are worried about things like hypersonic missiles and so forth, and the threat to carriers and surface ships and so on. Submarines are a unique capability, and having sufficient and robust and resilient capability subsurface, with all that carries with it in terms of silent operations, the ability to deliver attack from submarines against land operations as well as against surface ships and so forth. It's a very important capability. There's no doubt about that.
So we know who the key allies in this conflict will be for the US and Taiwan, notably AUKUS, Australia and the United Kingdom, Singapore, Philippines, Japan. But who are the players that we're seeing support China here?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure. I'm not honestly sure that how strong this alliance, if you like, with China would be. I mean, India is clearly a key player, and India is now, in population terms, bigger than China. And it's been very interesting watching how India has responded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, India's relationship with Pakistan, and Pakistan's relationship with China, and so forth. So I'm not clear in my own mind that India or Pakistan or other regional players are strongly supportive of China, but nonetheless, China is a big power, superpower probably in old terminology, and therefore they have to take them seriously, and they don't want to have conflict with China. But India has had conflict in the past. We know that in the north, quite serious conflict in the past. So I'm not sure who would be on China's side in this. Japan certainly wouldn't be. Most of the other islands wouldn't be. China, like Russia, one of the things in these conversations, we don't need to agree with the other side, but we need to understand their perception, their context, their history, and so on. China definitely believes that Taiwan is a part of China, as in the same way that Hong Kong and elsewhere. So we have to recognize the reality of that. But we also have to recognize, and we need to be strong about saying, if Taiwan wants to become part of China, let them have a referendum. And if they want to become part of China, they will become part of China, rather like the Falklands debate with Argentina. So as long as Taiwan does not want to become part of China and wants to stand out, we must be prepared to support them in that. And I think other nations in the area would be very concerned if China were to invade. Now, will they invade? I'm not convinced they will. This is not an easy operation. This is not like D-Day landings in France. This is, where the channel is relatively small and short. Taiwan is a relatively long way away from China. They could take some of the other islands that are closer to China, but there are only about 5 decent beaches for doing landings. They would obviously use air power and missiles and so on and so forth. They could cause an awful lot of damage. But in the war games that are being played, and the most recent one in America that was played on a wide range of scenarios, China wouldn't succeed. People would take serious casualties on both sides. But again, that's the message we want to be sending to China. We understand, we don't agree with, but we understand where you're coming from, but do not attempt to take Taiwan by force, because you will not be successful and there will be serious casualties.
But I guess if I were going to put myself into Xi Jinping's shoes for a second, I might be thinking that these attempts at what the West is calling deterrence are a major militarization of my coastline. You see this kind of chain forming of allies along China's coastline, with not many allies around that area for China to be supporting them. And I might just think, okay, before the US gets even more powerful in the region, I might just invade Taiwan now. I mean, is there a danger of maybe that happening?
Yeah, there's always a danger of that, and you're quite right to point it out. And it plays back into my earlier point that we do have to understand these from a Chinese perspective. But that's like deterrence back in the Cold War years. And you're too young to remember it, but all of the strategic analysis and how you play deterrence and the whole principles of tripwire and mutually assured destruction. And do you have large conventional forces to fight a conventional battle, or do you have very minimal forces, but you make it absolutely clear that if somebody sets a foot across the Indo-German border, then nuclear war will be the result. And that will only result in mutually assured destruction. So the messages you're sending as part of deterrence theory and the way you send them is extremely important. And to be honest, I think we in the West have lost that understanding of strategic deterrence theory. When the Cold War came to an end, all of the, and there were some wonderful academics around at the time, and all the military staff colleges, I was, attended various military staff college courses here in the UK, analyzed this stuff, and people understood it, and they understood how the messaging should go and so on. So we do need to we do need to understand China's perspective, and we do need to regain an understanding of how we play deterrence theory. And you're right, China could say, okay, you're building up these forces in the way that the Russians have complained and say that the Ukrainian operation is because NATO pushed too hard against its borders. Now, again, we have to come from the perspective that said we didn't force these people to join NATO. They democratically elected governments decided what they wanted to do. And Taiwan is a democratically elected government, and it will decide what it wants to do. So, yeah, they could say that, and they have made it fairly clear that they want, for the 100th anniversary, to have Taiwan back in, as part of China. But as I say earlier on, I'm not convinced that they will turn to the military option, as long as we stay strong and as long as we continue to send these powerful messages.
So do you see this conflict then playing out more like a second Cold War between the US and China rather than as an invasion like we've seen in Ukraine?
Yeah, I do. And I think the other thing which we must, as part of this conversation, we must acknowledge, which I touched on earlier, is that China, as much as anything else, is becoming an economic business. It's the Belt and Road initiatives. It's what they're doing in Africa. Huge investments in countries that they're trying to bring on side. Using old speak, it's developing an empire, and it's an economic empire which brings influence, and you bring influence through your financial clout and what you're prepared to put into these places. Now, I don't think they're doing it very cleverly, actually, and doing what they're doing in places like Kenya and elsewhere in Africa, where they're just bringing in Chinese labor and pouring money in. I'm not sure will produce in the long term what they're aiming for, but that economic piece is as much as important as the military piece. And in that sense, we, the West, are not winning that part of it. We're not putting in the same amount of investment. We're not building the links. And it's been very interesting, again, seeing the African response to Russian invasion of Ukraine and the global South. And essentially, and again, we've got to understand this perspective. We may not like it much, but we do need to understand that their view would be, hang on, you in the West invaded Iraq, you've been involved in Afghanistan, you've been involved in the Balkans, you've been involved in Syria and Yemen and all these other places, one way or another, and you've made a complete hash of it. Why should we be worried about a small place like Ukraine, which Russia historically claims is part of Russia anyway? Now, we may not agree with that, and I don't agree with it, but nonetheless, that perception of the global South and their links to people like China, is an important part of this conversation. I don't claim to be a Chinese expert, but I do feel that this is a serious long-term threat. We need to recognize it, and to be fair, the Americans do recognize it. I mean, they're putting a lot of effort into this whole area, and going back to where we were before, the link to Australia and others is a part of their response to that, and the pivot to the Pacific region and so forth that they've talked about. So yeah, that's my view, I think, overall.
I would never underestimate the military might of the United States as an American myself, but especially for countries like the United Kingdom, where we've seen, the British military kind of dwindle, paired with a lack of defense spending, as well as the enormous support they've given to Ukraine. I mean, is Britain and America's other allies really in a position right now to be supporting another war effort on the other side of the globe, while they've already given so much to Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a fair question. On the one hand, part of that reply is, of course, that as a result of Brexit and the government's, much vaunted comments like global Britain, what does that mean? And I've had these conversations with ministers and senior, current senior military people. What does that actually mean? And we have sent carriers to the Far East. We are supporting Australia in the AUKUS program, and we're doing other things too with people like Singapore and Malaysia and so forth. So there's an element of us looking to that part of the world, but the idea that we could engage in a major conflict in the Far East, I think is not realistic. Would we deploy some naval assets and air assets? Yes, I think we would. But in comparison to the Americans, it would be pretty small fry. I mean, we have always been obviously a major ally with the Americans in the last, since World War II, really, but in the last 30 years. And roughly speaking, we have put in about 10 to 15% of the fighting power, the combat power, alongside the Americans. So 1st Armored Division that I was a part of in the First Gulf War, part of 7 US Corps, part of the American deployment to the Gulf. We were a self-contained, fully sustainable armored division capable of fighting on our own, taking on a chunk of the battle, and sustaining ourselves logistically, medically, engineering, communications, etc., etc. There's no doubt that as a result of the changes over the last 20 years, we do not have the same capabilities we had back then. And it's not an easy argument. I don't blame the Defense Secretary. He's trying to put resources into new technologies, into space, into data, into AI, into all these other technologies that soak up resources. I don't agree that mass is unimportant, which is what the British government have been saying. And I think a division we do need to have that capability of putting a capable division in the field, and we don't have that. I mean, in some respects, we struggle to even sustain our operations in places like Estonia. We do have strong Navy capability, and we do have a strong RAF capability, but again, they're not far above critical mass in my view. And there are other areas within both of those domains that I think we should be doing more. Again, the government have put more money into defense, and in the current economic climate, with everything that's going on, I mean, I was just reading earlier on today, we're going to be spending over 100 billion a year paying debt interest. So, the economic situation is what it is. But do I think we should be spending more? Do I think we should have more capability? Yes, I do. But even then, I don't think we would send land forces to fight in the Far East. I do think we would send some Navy and air capability to support, but it would be relatively small. I mean, the US military is very powerful, and it's pretty good at conducting the sort of operations in the First Gulf War. It's not so good. I was involved in Baghdad in 2003 when the post-war whole failure just kicked in. But don't underestimate the power of the US military. It is still a very powerful organization with some very capable people. I mean, some of the best military brains in the world, undoubtedly, are senior US land, marine, air, and naval guys.
Is China becoming more aggressive in asserting its territory by sending warships to challenge warships of the US and Taiwan? Is that becoming a serious worry?
Well, it is, but nonetheless, again, from a Chinese perspective, what they're saying is, we want to make sure you understand that we have this capability, and we are going to be strong around this area. But the distinction for me is when you enter international waters and the international law about the free passage of ships and so forth through these international waters. What China is trying to do is to say our territorial waters are much bigger than anybody else is prepared to acknowledge. So by building these islands and so forth, they are creating what they are saying is their right to patrol these areas, and that the US and others should stay out of them because they are Chinese waters. Now, nobody accepts that other than China. I don't think there's any other nation that signed up to that. And certainly under international law, they're wrong. But, they are showing that, like all these things, part of deterrence, they're showing that they have the capability, that they are prepared to put combat power into these areas, and they're sending messages. One of the problems in all of these areas is historically, we know that wars often start through mishap, misunderstanding, accidents, etc., etc. And therefore, whenever you're bringing this sort of combat power close to each other, there's always a danger. There's always a risk that something stupid could happen, or something, I say stupid, unfortunate could happen. So I have, in a way, I have no problem with China saying this is our patch. We're here. We're creating a bigger capability. But I think, again, we have to be absolutely clear about what that means in terms of international law, and we need to exercise the right to a passage through these international waters, because there's a huge amount of trade, obviously, that flows through them apart from anything else.
Now, Tim, I don't have loads of time, so I wanted to talk about Russia's relationship with China really quickly.
Yeah.
When the war in Ukraine finishes, however it finishes, let's say it ends in some sort of defeat for Russia, and we see the Russian Federation being broken up into different states. Could we see China trying to take control of Siberia at the end of this conflict? Is that kind of their long game?
Well, anything is possible. There's no doubt that the relationship, from a Russian perspective, the relationship with China is important. I mean, if you go back through the Cold War years, their relationships were not good, and there were problems between the two. But in simple terms, Russia needs China, and China is the senior player in all of this. And I think the Chinese, I don't know what messages they're sending, but when it comes to things like the use of new tactical nuclear weapons and so on, I think the Chinese, amongst others, are sending messages to Russia to say, just be careful. We don't approve of that, in inverted commas. I think Russia is going to come out of this Ukraine war less powerful than it otherwise would have been. And yes, there is a danger that Russia will not implode, but it will break apart to some degree in the way you've described. Would China then use that opportunity? Well, yeah, it's possible. I don't think, again, I don't think it's probable, but it's undoubtedly something we should be keeping an eye on. And why does it matter? Well, like most of these things, it's not the territory in and of itself, it's what's inside the territory in terms of rare metals, rare earths, and all that sort of stuff. And China, again, extending its borders, is something that undoubtedly, it would like to do. It would feel more secure. I don't like the idea of it, but we do live in a world where these are just realities. So yeah, it's a possibility.
And I just had one final question to ask you. If China can't get Russia's help in this conflict, if Russia's not going to come to China's side in Taiwan, then what's in it for Xi Jinping? It seems like quite a one-sided deal that they have here.
Yeah, it's quite a difficult question to answer, really, because looking into the minds of Putin and people like the Chinese premier and so forth is a pretty difficult thing to do from a Western perspective. And as I said earlier, I don't claim to be a Chinese expert at all. Ultimately, we are talking about value systems and ways of life, and what we believe in terms of democracy and liberal capitalism and so forth. And in some respects, the West, I think the West is in trouble, actually, that our values are under threat. And we need to recognize that a large chunk of the world does not follow our value system, partly because of what we've been up to over the last 20 or 30 years and getting it badly wrong in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think, China wants Russia to stay reasonably strong, to keep the pressure on the West, to, in terms of things like oil and gas and economics and all the rest of it. So he wants them to continue to be a threat, to hold a focus for our own military capability, and for people like us and a large chunk of NATO to see that as their primary area of operations, and therefore to ensure that they don't pivot all of their capability over to the east and put China under pressure, or produce sufficient capability to do damage if they do decide to have a crack at Taiwan. So it's difficult to see how that relationship plans out. They're not sensible people. They don't see the world like we see the world, and these things change pretty rapidly depending upon circumstances and events. But ultimately, China and Russia belong to a system of thinking and operating that is different to ours, and we need to recognize that it is a conflict between values and ideas. And I spent 40 years of my life defending freedom and democracy and so forth, and I don't like what goes on in places like China and Russia, and we must continue to stand firm against it.